Sorry.
Okay, that's much better. Okay, great. So yeah. So first, thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy for the opportunity to present our work. So just can I have it like that? Yes. So just a few words about me and the team. So, oops. So we are in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure. In the Département d'études cognitives, the Cognitive Sciences Department, and in the Laboratoire des sciences cognitives et psycholinguistiques, the LSCP. And this is my team. We work on various topics, as I will explain, syntactic processing and single word processing. Our main interest is to understand the neural mechanisms underlying language processing in the brain. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and that's my main interest. And from past work, we know where in the brain language is processed, what are the main regions involved in language processing, and what are the typical processing times, but we still have a relatively poor understanding of how exactly language is processed and what are the underlying neural mechanisms. So in our work, we study various aspects of language, phonology, syntax, semantics, and orthography, and try to see whether we can understand the underlying neural mechanisms. And one of the main difficulties is that linguistic theory is described in terms of symbolic representations, whereas neural theory is described with continuous representations such as neural activation, synaptic weights, etc. So there is this difficulty to link these discrete objects into continuous dynamics. But now we have neural models, language models that can achieve high performance on a variety of linguistic tasks. And in these models, we have full access to neural activations and synaptic weights, and we can study the neural mechanisms, derive hypotheses about corresponding neural mechanisms in the human brain. So that's the general approach. We generate predictions from the neural models, and then we test them in behavioral experiments and neuroimaging and intracranial recordings. This gives a large range of resolutions from large neuronal populations and down to the single cell level. And intracranial recordings are in particular of interest to us because they allow us to study neural mechanisms and test more precise predictions from the models. So today I will discuss several studies from our lab. First part will be about sentence level processing, syntactic processing. I will show some evidence for selective syntactic processing in neural models, and also selective processing of semantic information in the human brain. Then I will discuss word level processing. And again, I will focus on structure versus content processing. I will show that at least in our first studies on this question, we haven't identified selective structural processing. And in contrast, we see that structure and content is relatively mixed in these models. And then I will show more recent work that goes beyond language currently, studying whether we can introduce structural bias into the models in order to better separate between structure and content processing. I will explain the motivation for this, and also new experiments that we have been running also on language processing with these models. So for the first part, first, to explain that there is many types of evidence for that sentences have a latent structure, what we call an hierarchical structure. One example for this comes from ambiguity. For example, if you read sentences like French onion soup, there are different ways to understand the meaning of the sentence, and it depends on the way we combine the single words into an integral meaning of the sentence. So this suggests that sentences have this kind of latent structure. Another evidence comes from substitution. If we take, for example, this sentence, the keys to the cabinet are on the table, we can substitute different parts of the sentence with single words. For example, we can take the cabinet and replace it with that, or we can replace the keys with they. So again, this shows that sentences have this constituent structure, and importantly, we cannot replace any sequence of words. For example, cabinet are here, we cannot replace it with a single word because it doesn't follow the hierarchical structure of the sentence. And another source of evidence comes from long-range agreements in language. For example, if we look at the sentence, the keys to the cabinet are, keys and are agree on their grammatical number, plural in this case, and this shows again that there is a latent dependency, a latent structure for the sentence. And there is a debate in the neuroscientific literature whether the brain processes syntax separately from semantics, the structure of sentences separately for their separated from their meaning. There is the classic view, the modular view, where syntax is processed in dedicated regions, for example, the Broca area in the inferior frontal gyrus or posterior STS. And there is the integrated view that suggests that semantic and syntactic processing cannot be separated in the brain, and this is researchers like Evelyn Fedorenko. And in this study, we tested whether a neural language model learn structure-sensitive processing, and we focus on this phenomenon that I showed before, long-range agreements, where there is a dependency between the main subject here and the verb. So we took what used to be the state of the art in the field. We took a language model based on LSTM units. We took a relatively large corpus, Wikipedia. We trained the model only on next word prediction. So there is, of course, no direct syntactic supervision. And then we ask whether this model learned the structure of long-range agreements. So in order to do that, we designed an experiment with several long-range agreement tasks, from very simple, where the subject and verb are adjacent, to more complicated one. For example, here, what we call the noun PP, where the subject and verb are separated by several words, and there is another noun that can interfere. And in this condition noun PP, we can think of 4 subconditions, depending on whether the subject and the interfering noun agree or not on the grammatical number. These are the congruent cases, and these are the incongruent cases. And the first thing we tried was to see whether the models first behaviorally succeed on these tasks. So we presented these sentences stopped at this time point, just one step before the verb, and compared the predictions of the model for the singular versus plural forms of the verb. And what we saw is that overall, these models succeed on this task, even for the more complicated one when there is a long-range agreement. This is the noun PP condition again. And also in the incongruent cases, they are at a relatively high performance, around 90%. And next, in order to understand the underlying neural mechanisms, we started with a simple experiment. We ablated different units in the model and retested the model on this test. And to our surprise, we found that there are only 2 neurons in the model. One that after its ablation, the performance of the model drops from around 90% to around chance level. And this is only when the main subject is plural, like here, boys. And the other neuron led to chance performance only when the main subject is singular. So next, we wanted to see what these units do exactly. I think I will not have time to go into the details of the LSTMs. But overall, the prediction is that given a sentence with a long-range agreement like here, we expect the mechanisms of the gating of LSTM units to be in this form, that the input gate will be open at this time point when the subject is presented, and then the forget gate will keep this information throughout the long range agreement. And if these two gates function this way, we expect the cell variable of the LSTM unit to store the information of the grammatical number. Here in blue, this is the singular number when the main subject is singular, and then the output gate to be open just one step before the verb for the correct prediction. And looking at the actual unit that caused after its ablation drop in performance to chance level, we see that overall the mechanism of this unit is similar to this prediction. And if we look at the other unit that caused drop in performance to around chance level in the plural case, we see that that's the mirror case. You can see here the red and blue swap with respect to whether the main subject is singular or plural. Okay, and next we ask how do these units, what we call the number units, the singular and the plural units, know when to open and close the gates. We hypothesize that there are other units in the network that encode the structure of the long-range agreement, regardless of the number, and convey this information to the singular and plural units. So we conducted a simple experiment trying to predict the depth of the syntactic tree based on activations of the units, and we found unit that is highly predictive of the depth of the syntactic tree, and it's active throughout a long-range agreement. So this is one example when there is no interfering noun, what is called an attractor, and this is the noun PP condition I showed before, where again this unit is active after the presentation of the subject throughout the long-range agreement and up to the verb. And this is also in longer long-range dependencies when there is also another verb. So it's not just the occurrence of a verb that caused this drop in activation, but the end of the long-range agreement. And even in super long dependencies, this unit is active throughout the entire agreement. So this shows that LSTM networks develop a dedicated mechanism for long-range agreements, and this mechanism is structure sensitive. As this unit shows, if you notice, the arrow bars here are very small, and these are averages across many sentences. It was 1,000 sentences, so it shows that this unit is not sensitive to the content of the sentence, but only to its structure. So next we tested whether this, what we call the syntax unit, connects indeed to the number unit that we identified with a different method, with the ablation method. And we looked at the synaptic connections between this syntax unit, this is the number of this unit, and the other two number units. And we found that indeed the weight, what we call the synaptic connections between the syntax unit and both number units are very high compared to all other connections to these units. So this shows that there is a mechanism, a small circuit, again dedicated to long-range agreements. And this, in a later study, we replicated across many models with random initializations across different languages, English and Italian, and also in Italian, also for gender agreement that we could not test in English. Okay, so next we were surprised by the sparsity of this neural mechanism. It was only 3 units out of 1,300 units in the network. And this begs the question what the network would do when there are more than a single long-range agreement. For example, here in the case of nested structures, where there are 2 long-range agreements, we therefore created a design, a factorial design. One dimension is whether the dependencies are successive or nested, and the other dimension is whether the inner dependency is short range or long range. And this is because we found that there are many other units in the network that encode grammatical number, but not for long-range agreements. So we hypothesized that these short-range units could help to predict the right form of the verb also when there are two dependencies that need to be treated simultaneously, but not in this case where there are two long-range agreements. The model is predicted to fail because once this neural circuit is occupied processing the outer dependency, there are no more resources in the network to process the inner one. So these are the four structures from the design. This is the error rate. And we can see here the performance of the model on the embedded dependencies versus the main one. For successive dependencies, the model achieves almost perfect performance. And when there are nested dependencies, the model starts to make more errors. In blue, you can see the case where the two subjects are congruent, so they have the same subject. In red, these are the incongruent cases, which are more interesting. And indeed, the model makes more errors on incongruent cases. And in particular, it makes more errors on inner dependencies compared to the outer dependencies. And this is the interaction, significant interaction here. And when the inner dependency is also long range, then the model makes many more errors. And again, this is a strong interaction effect here. So this shows that inner dependencies are more difficult than outer dependencies, although they are shorter. This is a prediction from the model that we tested in humans. We conducted the main experiment with humans showing the same stimuli and tested their performance. And overall, we see that there is a high similarity in the error rates. In particular, we see that humans make more errors on incongruent cases and, more importantly, more errors on inner dependencies compared to outer dependencies. Again, this is the significant interaction effect here. So overall, we see that there is a relatively high similarity between how models and humans process nested dependencies, that we also discuss later a certain difference between the two. Next, we ask whether transformer-based model that, since we started this study, revolutionized the field, whether they perform well on these more difficult conditions where there are two long-range agreements. First, when we look at the nested case where the inner dependency is short-range, GPT-2 achieves almost perfect performance. These are the different sizes of GPT-2. And when we test it on the case where the inner dependency is long range, we see that the model starts to make many errors, in particular on the incongruent cases when the main subject is plural and then we have singular and plural numbers. And in particular, the model is below chance level on this condition. So this means that the models pass from superhuman performance because this is much better than how humans process this kind of structures, object relative clauses, to below chance performance just by adding 3 words into the inner dependency. So this became later part of the big benchmark to test language models. And this failure of the model to process two long-range dependencies suggests that also transformers have this kind of sparse mechanism, at least behaviorally, to process long-range agreements. So since this work, there was another study by another group. This is Finlayson et al., where they looked at they conducted causal interventions in the models. They changed the activations of a neuron based on what the sentence would be in the wrong case, and this way they measured the output, the effect of each neuron on the output of the model. They quantify this with a measure called the natural indirect effect. And they tested it on different sentences similar to ours. And what they found is that for short-range agreement, for example, in the simple case when the subject and verb are adjacent, or the nested cases where the inner dependency is short-range, these are the profiles of the different models. There is an increase in this NIE measure for later layers. In contrast, when looking at conditions where there is long-range agreement, either with adverb between the subject and the verb or an interfering noun, the profile is very different. These are sentences with long-range agreement, and we see that there is a relatively high peak at the beginning, but also in middle layers of the model. Overall, very different between short-range and long-range agreement. So the conclusion is that also transformers use different mechanisms for short-range and long-range agreement.
Yair, do you hear me?
Yes.
I forgot to ask you whether you accept questions or comments during your talk, or you want it reserved, especially after the time delay, to the question and answer period.
Yes, of course, questions are welcome in the middle.
Then let me suggest that you mention, as you're going through these very interesting results, for those who are not linguists, but just computer scientists, could you say what basic hypotheses are being tested with all of these variants, the long range, the short range, and especially the fact that the input data are very different for the human language learner and the large language model.
So here the main hypothesis tested is that neural language models use distinct types of mechanisms to process grammatical dependencies between subject and verb. When the subject and verb are adjacent, the model predicts the correct number of the verb based on a certain mechanism, and when there are several words that separate the subject and the verb, then there is another mechanism that is dedicated to that. We found it in LSTMs and later in transformers, and this study dwelled in more detail, and we show another study to show that indeed there is a separate mechanisms for the same type of dependency, but it's only that what matters is whether it's short range or long range.
Okay, I understand that. Everyone understands this local hypothesis, but there's something more general in the background, as we all know. Is there any relation to the claims that have been made that this structural dependence has to be innate rather than learnable?
Yeah, so I will get to this in the discussion, in the intermediate discussion, so in a few slides. So
okay, go ahead.
So in a more recent study, this is Ferrando and Costayusa, looked at the precise mechanism for long-range agreements. They did what is called the activation patching. They looked at the clean sentence and a corrupted sentence where they swapped the grammatical number of the subject. And they replaced the activations of the clean with the corrupted, and in this way they could identify specific parts of the model that are responsible for this kind of long-range agreements. And what they found is very interesting. They identified that a specific attention head of the transformer at layer 13 is highly interrupts with the long-range agreements. And this is invariant across different languages. So this was with multilingual model, GEMA, and they tested this both in English and Spanish, and repeating the same procedure, they identified the same head that is responsible for these long-range agreements. And looking at the readout of this head with the MLP, they found that it's a specific unit of the MLP that is involved in long-range agreements. So that again shows that language models tend to develop a sparse mechanism for this kind of long-range agreements. In our lab, we conducted a simple experiment. We took the same sentences and removed the linguistic material between the subject and the verb and tested whether it's still the same mechanism. And we found that, consistent with the previous result, there is a separate mechanisms for short-range agreements. It's, for example, here, head number 7 in layer 13 is not involved in this short-range agreement. So this is evidence for these distinct types of processing and mechanisms for long and short-range agreements. And there is another evidence that comes from the processing of simple auditory sequences. For example, if you listen to a sequence of tones like beep, 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 sorry, I will do it, beep, 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 boop, your brain will react with a typical response, relatively short, around 100 or 200 milliseconds, around the superior temporal gyrus, whereas if you listen to the same sequence but with a context, so for example, there will be a context beep, 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 boop, beep, 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 boop, beep, 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 boop, and then beep, 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 beep. In this case, there will be another network in the brain that will react to this violation. Now it's a global violation of the entire pattern and not local. So this suggests that for auditory processing, there are distinct type of mechanisms to process these local short-range dependencies and global. So given this evidence from the models and from auditory processing, we tested whether this is the case also for the human brain for language processing. We conducted an experiment where we contrasted long-range dependencies with local transition-based dependencies. And we compared the predictions from the models and humans using MEG. This is a recording technique in neuroscience that has a relatively high temporal resolution. So for the models, as expected, we were able to disentangle the mechanisms for long range and short range. This is the violation. This is the long range dependency and the transition effect. This is the short range dependency. Whereas in humans, we found that only the violation effect was detectable. We see here that around 600 milliseconds, we see a high decoding performance only for the long-range violation, whereas the short-range non-syntactic violation was not detectable with MEG. So this suggests that humans might process short-range and long-range dependency differently than the models. However, it could also be that the MEG lacks the desired resolution in order to identify. So we are now running the experiment also with intracranial recordings where we have higher spatial temporal resolution. But what is interesting to point is that for auditory processing, the local effect is very simple to identify in the brain. And it also doesn't require attention of the patients or the subjects. Whereas the global effect, the long-range effect, is more difficult to elicit in the brain, and it requires an attentive state. Whereas what we find, at least in the MEG, is that the global effect, the syntactic effect, is easy to identify, whereas the local effect, in contrast to auditory processing, is more difficult. Okay, and in another study, this is in collaboration with Jean-Rémy King from Meta AI and Pablo, we extended the work from dependencies that are specific to subject-verb, so for example here, to the entire syntactic tree, all the dependencies in a sentence. And we suggest a method to decode this information from the activations of the model. This is based on previous work by Hewitt and Manning, where they proposed what is called the structural probe. The idea is very simple. We take a sentence, present it to the model. We extract the activations, the embeddings, different layers, and we learn a mapping, a linear transformation, such that after the projection by this transformation, the pairwise distances between the words in the projected space, the probe space, will approximate as close as possible the theoretical distances between the words based on linguistic theory, the number of dependencies, the arcs that are between any two words. In the polar probe, we extended this. It's a simple extension. In addition to the existence of a dependency between two words, we also try to decode its identity, its type, whether it's a determiner or subject-verb dependency, and so on. And the hypothesis is that distances in the probe space encode for the existence, whereas the orientation, the direction, would encode for the type of the dependency. So what we found is that compare to the structural probe, we can first perform as well on the existence of dependencies of the tree. And for the dependency type, we can decode the dependency type with a relatively high performance. And the information, the syntactic information, mainly resides in intermediate layers of the model. We can, after training this polar probe, we can take different sentences, project them to the polar space, conduct a simple PCA analysis, and this is the result. The gray areas, these are the averages across, average area across many sentences. And what we can see is that the subject and the verb, for example, stays in the same position across different sentences. And when we add embedded clauses to the sentence, again, the main dependency remains relatively in the same position in the probe space. And we see that the nested parts that we add to the sentence are reflected in the probe space in different regions. And again, it's relatively stable across different sentences. This is just a visualization across different layers of the model. And what's important is that we see that the structure of the sentence, the dependency tree, can be linearly read out from model activations with a relatively high performance. I will also discuss later limitations of that. In another study, we were interested in the evolution, the acquisition of these syntactic trees during training of these models, and in particular to see whether what is suggested in linguistic theory about acquisition stages is reflected in the learning of the model. This is the growing tree hypothesis that suggests an interesting acquisition order. Without getting into the linguistic details, the main idea is that the child acquires more and more complicated structures of sentences in a very specific order. The first part, it's divided into three main parts. The first part is what is called A movement. The second part is the ability to understand WH questions. This is based on syntactic movement. And the latest stage is the acquisition of embeddings. This is, again, another type of syntactic movement. And when looking at the data, we see these three stages in a group of children. And what is interesting is that we always see that children follow this specific order. There are no children that first acquire stage A and stage C, and only then stage B. So we tested whether this is the case also with language models, and the advantage of language models is that we can also contrast different hypotheses. With children, we can only sample their performance at relatively distant stages, and with the model we can test the acquisition at in high temporal resolution, and we can disentangle whether what looks like as three separate stages is actually a more continuous learning curve. So in order to test this hypothesis in the model, we looked at long-range agreements across different structures based on the growing trees hypothesis. And we found that models too follow this order. First, they acquire simple agreements, then agreements across questions, and only then agreements across embedded structure like object relative clauses. So this shows that models follow a similar pattern to humans, that their acquisition follows the structure of the syntactic tree. Okay, so to summarize the findings so far, we first discussed an open question in neuroscience, whether structure is processed in the brain separately from semantics. Again, there are these two opposing views, the classic view and the integrated view. From our simulation work, we found evidence for structure-sensitive processing, these neural circuits that naturally emerge in the network, and it's dedicated to a specific syntactic phenomenon. We saw that neural language models and humans process nested structures in a relatively similar way. They diverge in a specific case where the models are below chance level, and we saw this leads to brittle syntactic processing, also in transformers. And also that the models and children follow similar acquisition trajectories that follow the structure of the syntactic tree. With the polar probe, we saw that we can read out in a linear way the structure of the entire syntactic tree with a relatively high performance. And the main question is, given that this shared processing between humans and models, is syntactic selectivity a fundamental property of both neural models and the human brain? Maybe we can stop here for questions. We are now, as I mentioned before, we're exploring this direction with intracranial recordings.
Okay, people that are remote can ask questions, and go ahead, Brian. Brian.
To turn my audio on. Sorry. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. I really am glad that you're working on this. I do have a couple questions, but the main one first is about the child language data and the growing tree, which I'm actually not familiar with, but it's an interesting idea. But when we look at the acquisition data for children for WH questions, it's a very old finding in child language that this is very, very differential depending on the nature of the WH word, where what comes in, I guess maybe who comes in early, and how is maybe a year later. So how does this, décalage, you might say, between the different lexical items fit in with this, with your model or with the growing tree, or maybe more I care about your model, yeah.
Yeah, so in this study, it was more like a proof of concept to show the advantages of language models in looking into these questions. We did not look in this resolution at specific lexical items. So it was based only on the general three stages suggested by Friedman and Ritzi. But I think that this study shows the potential. So we can now, with the model, we can easily look into the acquisition of specific WH questions, for example. Also in Friedman and Ritzi's paper, they suggest that there are stages within the second stage of WH questions.
Yeah, I was afraid of that because, obviously, two extreme theories that this is, God-given growing tree versus the more usage-based, which focuses on lexical, but probably something in between, huh?
But maybe something to add here. Another advantage of language models is that we can, for example, we can see whether there is a computational principle for this kind of acquisition stages, or whether, for example, it's just frequency. So
right. No, that would be great. Yeah, that would be
so
great.
that's now also with Ronadan that here, Malo in the lab. We are now testing this with the models. We actually create training data sets where we manipulate the frequency of WH questions, of object relative clauses. We retrain the models, and we see whether we see the same pattern despite these manipulations.
Well, probably you'll see both,
Yes,
which is fine. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you.
For the francophones, WH questions in English are Q questions in French, qui,
Right.
etc. And there's an equivalent for all analytic languages for that category. Any other questions? Also here, I want to ask you, when you say that it's predicted by linguistic theory, what linguistic theory, or not predicted, which linguistic theory do you have in mind?
Sorry, in which context?
As you were giving your data, you were saying, according to linguistic theory, this should happen or it shouldn't happen. Which linguistic theory were you referring
so
to?
of course, yeah. Each time it depends on the yes, on the theory. So yeah. Do you have a specific slide in mind so I could?
No. It's just for pedagogic reasons that I'm asking these questions. So, so
Yeah.
they're underlying these local hypotheses. There are no general excuse me, I lost my voice yesterday. No, general linguistic hypotheses, more general ones that you were particularly interested in. We'll only hear about that at the end.
Yeah. Yes. So I think, at least for long-range agreements, I think it's not controversial, and it's a relatively simple phenomenon. And yeah, and finding the neural mechanism that performs it in LLMs in the brain is, I think, is interesting and independent of a specific theory. For acquisition, of course, we tested a specific theory, the growing trees hypothesis, and of course there could be there are other theories that could be tested.
Okay, thank you, Ryan.
Well, but you could say that also you tested the Manning hypothesis about the dependencies. So that's a different linguistic theory, and that's fine. I mean, I think you have to look at different possible accounts of different phenomena. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I think it. You're on again.
Okay, great. So before moving to the word level processing, and actually it's relevant for both. Just to mention an interesting phenomenon from neuroscience. Perhaps most of you are familiar with that. These are concept cells that are found in a specific area of the brain, which is called the medial temporal lobe, the MTL. This is it's composed of mainly of the hippocampus, amygdala, and entorhinal cortex. And what's interesting about these neurons in this region is that they are highly selective to specific concepts. This is an example from Kian Quiroga, where each line here is the firing of the neuron. This is the onset of the stimulus. And when, for example, the image of Harry Potter is presented, the neuron starts to fire in a relatively high rate. And also when the patient is presented with the name of Harry Potter or the sound. So it shows that the response is amodal. And if we compare the responsiveness of this unit, this neuron, to different stimuli, we can see that it's highly responsive here to these three presentations of this stimulus, and it's almost silent to all other stimuli in the experiment. So this shows that the existence of neuron in the human brain that are highly selective to the content, not the structure of language. And in a recent study, we further studied these neurons. I will skip the details just to say that these neurons, when we explore, we developed an online paradigm where we can modify the stimuli in real time based on responses on previous stimuli. And we found that a neuron its activity covers a small region in the semantic space. This is a 2D projection of the semantic space, and the color is the activation of the neuron. And we see that this neuron is highly active. Again, these are the firings of the neurons to different stimuli that are semantically similar, whereas it's almost silent to different stimuli that are less semantically similar. Okay, so now to move to the word level, what I like about single word processing that it's kind of an atomic problem of language. It's much more simple. It's easier in experiments to control for example, prosody and other aspects of the stimuli, while it's still rich because it addresses several fundamental questions in cognitive neuroscience. For example, how to bind content structure. Even for a sequence of phonemes, there is a question how the human brain binds the position of a phoneme and its identity. For example, to distinguish these two words, broad and board. And beyond the linear order, there is also in single words there is hierarchical structures. For example, if we look at word like unlockable, just like the example before on French onion soup, there could be different ways to combine the meaning of the morphemes here, unlock and able, whether it's unlockable, so not lockable, or unlockable, able to be unlocked.
I have a question again.
Yes.
You said bind, and the word is in is in the language of several different specialties. But what do you actually mean?
By binding?
Yep.
So here I meant for example phoneme position and phoneme identity, in order to distinguish the word like broad and board.
What is the work that is being done for you by the act of binding? What does binding mean? I understand the distinction between the two, but what is binding?
Oh, for the neural system is to be able to first disentangle this information from the input, that there is the position of each phoneme and the identity of each phoneme, and then re-encode this information together as an entire word that could distinguish between the representation of broad and board, for example. But maybe it will get clearer later.
Okay, thank you.
And the third point is about dual root processing. We can process single words from different inputs, acoustic input, written text, and we can produce single words through writing or through speech. So there is the question of how words are encoded in the brain in an A-model way compared to modality specific. There could be, in this case, 4 different tasks. Copying, this will be visual input, and then writing, there will be reading, so visual input and speech output, and so on. And there is a cognitive model that suggests the different processing stages and the flow information during these various tasks. To give an example from reading, if we focus only on this part of the model, the cognitive model suggests that single words are processed through 2 different routes, one which is called the lexical route and the other is the sublexical route. And in this case, if we look at the word none, if it's written if it's written, then we will produce it as none. But if there is a deficit in this part of the model, the lexicon, this is the part where this is a long-term memory component of the model where the visual aspect of the words is stored. This is what is called surface dyslexia. It will correspond to a deficit around the fusiform gyrus. Then the patient or the person would be obliged to read the word through the sublexical route based on the standard grapheme to phoneme conversion rules. And this would mean that this word will be output as known, because when we have, just like we read bone, for example. So this suggests that there are 2 routes to process single words. One lexical route that is based on long-term memory and it's relatively fast, and another which is the sublexical route, which is slower and it's based on rules and the structure of the words. So in this study, we tested whether neural models learn to disentangle the positions of the letters in a word and their identity. We looked at a specific type of architecture that is called the beta variation autoencoders. And it can be seen as a neural model that performs the copying task. The model is given an image of a written text. It compresses it into a lower dimensional space, and then it needs to reconstruct the original image. So it's very similar to the copying task. And we train different models on these sequences of letters. These are examples of models here with relatively high performance that can reconstruct the original image in relatively high precision. And this is a version, this is the beta version of autoencoders. The beta part means that the model can, with this hyperparameter, we can encourage the model to disentangle different factors in the input. The larger the beta is, the stronger the disentanglement is. So here we can see the reconstruction loss versus the disentanglement. And we picked models that are on this, what is called the Pareto front, that have both good reconstruction performance and strong disentanglement, again, in the motivation to look into models that disentangle the position and the identity of the letters. And we constructed 3 different evaluation tasks. One for the spatial position. So we trained the models on words that appeared in just these parts of the image, and we leave out a small part of the image, and we repeat it, of course, in a cross-validation manner. We tested for length generalization, so we trained the model on specific length, and then we test the performance of the model on left-out length. And then we have compositional generalization, where we train the model on all combinations of letters, for example, A and B in all positions, except for the combination of specific letter in a specific position. For example, here, B in the first position. I will skip the results for the spatial generalization. The model was very good at that. What about length generalization? We see that overall, these models are achieve relatively poor performance on length generalization. You can see here an example. The model is given a word with 5 letters, and it fails. And the left out test was words with 5 letters, and the model, the reconstructed image, has only 4 letters, just like you see here in many examples. So it fails on length generalization. What about compositional generalization? So again, the model is trained, for example, on all combinations of A and B's in the different positions, except for B in a specific position. The performance is even lower. These are, again, our specific examples. You can see here a word with B at the last position, but the model in its reconstructed image changes it into A. So this shows that beta variation autoencoders fail to disentangle letter position, letter identity, and they lack any notion of word length. This is very different from how humans process orthographic information. And again, there is no clear separation of content and structure, in this case, letter identity and letter position. In a similar study, we looked at the word repetition task. If we looked into the cognitive model, the part that describes word repetition, we have a speech input and the information flows again into 2 different routes, a lexical route and a sublexical route. The lexical route is based on long-term memory. This is where it's used for known words, and this information where this information resides. And we have the sublexical route, which is used for new words. For example, here a pseudo word, where we need to use short-term memory or working memory in order to process it. So in this study, we built a neural model that performs the word repetition task. It has an encoder-decoder architecture that mimics the comprehension and production parts of the cognitive model. And we trained it on the entire English lexicon with sensitivity to the frequency of the word. So more frequent words were presented more times to the model. And then we conducted 3 types of studies: a behavioral study, a neural study, and a developmental study. In the behavioral study, we looked at known effects from humans. For example, length effect. This is in regions of the models that are based on short-term memory. Longer words should be more difficult for the model, so elicit more errors. There is the primacy and recency effect, where early positions in the phoneme sequence and the later positions are less sensitive to errors. And there are other effects. I will not have time to go into all details. In order to study this in the model, we created the experimental design, just like we do in psycholinguistics. We created a factorial design where we have different dimensions: the lexical dimension, we have real words versus pseudo words, we have morphologically simple versus complex words, short versus long words, and words that are high frequent or low frequent. And first, behaviorally, we found that first, this was a selection criterion of the model. We selected models that perform perfectly on all real words in the lexicon. So this is the error rate, and this is the sequence length. We see that performance is perfect, and the model also succeeded on the pseudo words with more than 97% of success. There were several errors on pseudo words, and there was a length effect. So pseudo words that were longer, the model made more errors on them. And there was also a morphological effect. There was this interaction here with respect to morphological complexity. Complex words were more simpler for the model. And this can be also modeled with a simple regression model to predict the errors of the model based on the different dimensions of the experimental design. We also saw that the model shows primacy and recency effects. This is known from the previous literature that, again, early and late positions are less prone to errors. This is the success, and this is the error. So this is, in our case, the prediction is in inverse U-shape. And we saw that also in the models, we found this inverse U-shape. So overall, we found that the model replicates several findings from humans. And we were most interested in dual root processing, whether we find that dual root processing naturally emerged in the model during training. So to study this, we conducted an ablation study, and the prediction is as follows. If we contrast the percentage of errors on pseudo words versus real words, pseudo words are processed through the sublexical route, and real words should be processed via the lexical route. Then we would expect that ablation of units from the lexical route will cause to errors mostly on real words and not on pseudo words, and vice versa for the sublexical route. This will suggest a double dissociation. And what we found is that in the model, the sublexical and lexical processing is entangled. So we see that in this case, the ablations of different units resides here on the diagonal. So in the model, we did not find a dissociation for lexical versus sublexical processing. Next, we thought that maybe ablation is too rough of a measure, and we could instead predict the activations of a unit based on the different dimensions of the design. In particular, lexicality and the frequency would suggest a lexical processing, and the length will suggest sublexical processing. So these are the profiles of different units. Here on the x-axis, these are the different units, and on the y-axis is the feature importance of the different dimensions in their ability to predict the activations of the unit. And these feature importance profiles are clustered, and what we found is that there are only 2 clusters and no clear dissociation, again, between lexical and sublexical processing. And what is interesting about these neural models is that they can allow us to study also their neural mechanisms and the neural geometry, and as mentioned before, to generate predictions about corresponding mechanisms in humans. What is known from humans, from the human brain about phonological processing is that single phonemes are clustered based on manner of articulation. This is in the superior temporal gyrus during comprehension, but we still don't know how sequences of phonemes are encoded. And for this, we could use the models in order to generate predictions. And this is the results for both production and perception in different brain regions. I think I don't have time, so I will gloss over it. What is still unknown is how sequences of phonemes, like here, are represented in a neural manifold. So what we did next was to look into the neural activations of the model. Here we have the representations of single phonemes, and we see that if we cluster them, we see 2 main groups for vowels and consonants. The model was given the phonemes as one-hot vector, so this is not acoustic information, and yet we see that there is a clustering based on vowels and consonants, so that's reassuring. And when we look at the neural representations of trigrams of phonemes like CCV, CVC, CNVs for consonants and vowels, we can see that first, there is a clustering based on the identity of the first phoneme, whether it's consonant or a vowel. These are these 2 clusters. Then we have a subclustering based on the second phoneme, whether it's consonant or a vowel. These are the different colors. And then there is another nested clustering based on the third phoneme, whether it's consonant or a vowel. So we see that there is this nested structure that emerged in the model, which looks like an onion. We have the first phonemes represented in relatively large scale, and the more phonemes we add, the scale gets closer. This can also be illustrated like that. We have first separate clusters for consonants for the first phoneme, whether it's a consonant or a vowel, and then this splits into smaller and smaller scale, a bit like fractals, until we get the representations of sequences of 3 phonemes. We can also measure it directly from the resulting size of the embedding for different phoneme sequences, and we see that indeed we have this convergence, which is consistent with this kind of onion-like encoding. And this is for the position. So the position would be encoded in different scales, smaller and smaller scales. And the hypothesis of the onion hypothesis suggests that the identity of the phoneme is encoded in direction of the neural space. So this means that the content, the identity of the phoneme and its structure, its position, its ordinal position, are encoded in different aspects of the neural space. The direction encodes for the identity, and the scale encodes for the position. We are now running the same experiment with acoustic models. This I can tell more later. Okay, so to summarize the second part, psycholinguistic theories suggest that single words are processed via 2 routes, a lexical route and a sublexical route. We saw that the neural word repetition model can mimic several known effects from humans. We found, however, only a single dissociation or even no clear dissociation between lexical and sublexical processing. And we saw that looking into the neural activations, the neural model suggests an onion-like encoding, where the position of the phoneme is encoded in smaller scales and the identity as the direction in the neural space. So what we see is that based on the onion hypothesis, the structure of the sequence, the ordinal position, is encoded in the scale, whereas the content is encoded in the direction. Therefore, structure-context separation occurs in the geometry of the neural space and not in the architecture, like selective units in the model. This onion encoding also provides an explanation for the primacy and recency effect, because if the first phonemes are encoded in larger scales, they are more robust to errors, whereas the last positions, given that that's a recurrent neural network, similar to how the brain processes information, this information has less noise, and therefore last positions are less prone to errors. Okay, questions so far before the last part?
We have very little time, so
okay, so I will go quickly through the last part. So this is a study where we first tested structure and content separation in a navigation task. So imagine, for example, that you are given these instructions, a sequence of actions, for example, going right, and then seeing a duck, going right and again, and going right, you see a deer, and so on. And after a certain point, you're asked to predict what is the next observation. Is it a dog, a deer, or so on? So in order to solve this task, having a cognitive map that represents the structure of the problem, in this case it's the 2D space, could help a lot in order to predict the next token. For example, here, if we go, this illustration corresponds to this sequence. If we go twice right and we see a duck and so on, it would be simple to predict that the next token is the duck. So again, structure and context separation could help in generalization. And from neuroscience, it is known that indeed in the medial temporal lobe, the MTL, the Euclidean space is encoded in specific neurons called grid cells and place cells. This is like a special navigation network that encode the structure of the world separately from its content. And in this work, in collaboration with Salvador Mascarenhas and Victor, we developed a new architecture based on transformers, where we introduce this kind of bias, encouraging the model to separate the structure and the content. So here, given this sequence of items, the model would learn that these arrows correspond to actions. They will map into the positional encoding of the model. Whereas the observations, the different objects, will be encoded in the value part of the model. And we compared map formers to several baselines in the literature with different positional encodings of transformers, and we found that only map formers generalize in an OOD way out of distribution to longer sequences, larger spaces, etc. And map formats could be extended to different domains, not only for navigation, but also to other structural relationships between, for example, hierarchical relationship in a company, the hierarchical structure in the lexicon, or of course, the hierarchical structures in language syntax, as we saw before. Most recently, we trained map formers on formal languages. This is the DIC language, where we have a sequence of brackets that need to agree with a specific structure. And what we saw that map formers generalize to longer sequences and deeper structures from this DIC language compared to baseline models. So to summarize this part, the separation of structure and content is important for generalization, for out-of-distribution generalization. Models can be encouraged to encode structure separately from the content by introducing specific structural biases. When doing so, map formers indeed generalize better to out-of-distribution cases compared to baseline models. And map formats can be used to learn cognitive maps from different domains, not only from navigation, and as I showed, also in the case of language.
Your sound is slow.
I think that we are out of time. I put here several points for discussion that maybe we can discuss together also from the document that you sent me.
Okay, we're open for questions. I'm not in very good shape for asking questions. Go ahead. 1 second.
Hi, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, which was visual also. I have a question regarding cognitive maps. You just talked about, within map frame. I would like to know, or you had to have your insight if this research is like could be preliminary to any other kind of research on system 2, like IA, able to do some reasoning. We would have to define what reasoning would be in this case.
Yes, so yeah, it's very relevant to the system 1, system 2 distinction. Overall, I think that dual root processing is something that could be important for AI. The work I showed on word level processing is also based on this intuition that neural systems, at least the human brain and artificial neural systems could be developed to do the same, use 2 different way of processing, one which is based on long-term memory, which is based on memorization, and the other one which is slower, that is important for generalization, and in particular OOD generalization, that needs, based on this argument, to separate the structure of the input from its content. And this is true for word level processing, like I showed for the ordinal position versus the identity. For the sentence level processing, this is the semantic content versus the syntactic structure of the sentence. And this is also true for reasoning, where we can use heuristics or based on memorization versus system 2, which is slower and that needs to represent the structure and to combine the information, similar to how we do it in other structure-like routes.
Yeah.
Are there other questions, remote or local? I'll extend. Yeah, okay. I'll try you. Go ahead.
First, hello. Thank you for this talk.
Out loud.
Are you able to hear me from here first? Yes, okay. So at least to me, it seems the underlying theme or like this underlying theory that's being tested with this idea of, I guess, autonomous syntax is universal grammar being something being either, is there something innate to the structures that we have? And it seems at least that LLMs are able to be quite close to humans, but also be failing at other parts of it. I guess the question that I'm asking is, what do you think it is doing with these structures, the structures in language, and whether it has been able to pick up UG, like universal grammar constraints?
Yes. So I think this debate about innateness in AI terms is about structural bias, and so the way we would give a model an innate knowledge would be a specific structural bias that would help it to learn faster, and also later to show behavior that is similar to that of human. From what we currently see, the language models do not have structural bias that is similar to that of human. This is maybe not surprising. The human brain has lots of information that is innate, that was acquired through a long process of evolution, that is also a computational process that involves a lot of learning. Language models do have some structural bias. For example, they are deep, so they have this hierarchical processing. But of course, this is very different from the human brain, and this can be compensated by providing these models with a lot of data, so they can still learn things similar to humans. But then, when tested carefully, for example, in the case with nested dependencies, when two of them are long range, we can see that they behave differently than humans. So it means that they approximate to a good extent the way humans process language, but it's not precisely this. And one of the reasons for this could be that they lack the structural bias that humans have and children have. So that's my view.
Okay. Tu peux poser ta question en français.
Ah, ok, si vous comprenez le français. Bonjour Yair. J'avais une question concernant votre troisième partie sur les maps formeurs. Est-ce que vous comptez implémenter des architectures, ou est-ce que vous avez testé déjà les maps formeurs sur des environnements 3D? Est-ce qu'ils sont capables de représenter des cartes cognitives en 3D également, ou c'est uniquement en 2D?
Yair, peux-tu vite traduire et puis répondre?
So I will reply in English. So in the paper, if you look in the appendix, we tested also the case of 3D. I'm not sure if this is the motivation for the question, but the difference is that the operations are not commutative, so it's more difficult to learn with map formers. So we showed that map formers can also learn 3D navigation, but less good than 2D. We still don't have a good solution for the commutativity, and this is the commutativity problem is not specific to 3D. For example, in family trees, you have the same problem because, for example, the father of the mother is not the same as the mother of the father. You will end up in different persons, whereas this is only a commutation of the two operators. So we don't have a solution for that, but yes, we tried that, and it's in the appendix of the paper if you're interested in more detail.
Merci.
Okay. I think we have to call it off. It's not your fault. It was because of the time lost in the beginning. I want to thank you to the extent that I can with my throat for an extremely rich, too rich presentation. We didn't have long enough time to well on each component of it. One of the things that I would have liked to ask about when you talk about structure and content was, do you really mean by, I understand structure, I understand phonetic structure, syntactic structure. Do you really mean that content is that visual cartoon that you were using in the concept itself? The meaning of the word, I don't remember which one you displayed, its content, and not its meaning, but its referent, was that visual cartoon.
So yeah, so I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but as I see it, this is why I mentioned the grid cells, place cells, and the concept cells, because both of them are found in the MTL, and they seem to represent very different aspects of the input. One would represent the position of the object in space, and the other will represent its content, whether it's a cookie like we have in these images, or whether it's Harry Potter, and so on. And there should be a way for the brain. So it seems that the brain disentangles this information, something that we do not yet see in standard transformers, for example. This is the motivation behind map formers, to introduce this bias. And so first to disentangle, and then to compose this information back together in order to create episodic memory, and to be used also in working memories for reasoning and so on.
Well, episodic, you think of words as proper names, where Harry Potter refers to an individual, and you can have one snapshot of the individual. But I'm asking you whether you really think that the snapshot of the individual and its relation to the phonetic, the syntactic, etc., is the relation between content and structure.
No, I think that the content is of course, is the abstract aspect of all these stimuli. What are concepts exactly? It's a difficult question. But it can be elicited by different aspects of the concept. It could be by an image, it could be by the word, and all this seems to elicit the same neuron in this case.
Okay, well, yes, we can't go further in that. I want to thank you for your presentation and apologize for the two things, the loss in time and my loss in voice. And I hope the video will appear soon, and there'll be a lot more looking at it than saw it live. And I hope that, oh, by the way, you know that your co-author, King, was one of our speakers as well.
Yep.
Okay, so I hope we'll be able to hear from you again in the next iteration of these extremely rich and interesting meetings. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.